They often look at the fact that we've not been able to have any multilateral agreements for a few years. We've not been able to move some plurilateral agreements forward as a sign that the WTO is failing and that we're not keeping up with the reality. But if you're really on the inside, you can see that we're discussing a lot of really relevant contemporary issues.
Welcome to Treasury Payments, the podcast unlocking the future of cross-border finance.
From transaction banking and money movements
to liquidity, treasury, and cash management.
We bring you expert insights and the latest trends shaping global finance.
So Matthew, welcome to Treasury Payments.
It's a great pleasure to be here, finally to be able to talk to you.
So to kick things off, can you just tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and the journey that's led you to your current role?
Sure. So Matthew Wilson, the Ambassador of Barbados to the WTO, the United Nations, and other international organizations in Geneva. Also Ambassador for Switzerland, for Italy, for Austria. And when you're from a small country, you have to have many, many tools in your toolbox. But more importantly, I'm from Barbados, which, as you know, is a beautiful island in the Caribbean, who's actually been doing a lot of wonderful work on advocacy around climate change issues, dealing with the global financial architecture, looking at issues of risks and insurance and climate disaster clauses, led by an incredible Prime Minister Mia Motley. So we're a small country, but we have big thoughts, big ambitions, and we see our role as helping to support issues of the global commons as well.
Awesome. So what first sparked your idea, or your interest in trade and development, and how has that kind of evolved over your career?
When I speak to young students, I said, don't be too hard on yourself if when you're 19, 20, even 21, you're not 100% sure what you want to do. I did law, I did history, I did psychology. That was the area that I wanted to get into. And then I discovered international relations. And in international relations, you have a little bit of trade, anthropology, economics, politics, diplomacy. It was just this wonderful soup of the most amazing elements of work. And then I joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Barbados. I was posted to Geneva for a few years. Then I joined the World Trade Organization. I was in the cabinet of Director General Pascal Lamy. And I was also focused on development work when I was there. And then I joined the International Trade Center as the Chief of Staff to Arantxa Gonzalez. And I was there for 8 years. And then I did some work on partnerships and diversity and inclusion. And then 2.5 years later, here I am as Ambassador of Barbados. And I just find trade is such a fascinating area. Trade is not a sector. Trade is every single thing that we do, everything we consume, everything we produce. And I think that it is something that is really, truly about people. And I think sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we put policy over people far too many times. But this really is about giving people decent jobs, a decent standard of living, about addressing sustainable development issues and the future of our planet. So I find it's a really fascinating area to be involved in. It can be quite dense, quite econometrically complex, but ultimately it is about how do we get goods and services from A to B and to do it in the most efficient way possible and in a way that creates employment and supports sustainable development.
And I would imagine, coming from a small island state, that there would be some unique trade vulnerabilities and challenges that you would face in countries like that. What are some structural shifts needed to support the integration of small island states into broader global value chains?
Now, frankly, small island developing states are some of the most vulnerable countries in the world to everything that you can think of. Let's just take climate, for example. A few years ago, there was a devastating hurricane in the Caribbean, and it wiped out the GDP of one of our islands in 1 hour. Can you imagine that? The GDP of that island was wiped out in 1 hour. And these are the kind of vulnerabilities, the realities that we live with every day in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, in some of the African small island developing states as well. These are our realities. Many of us also rely very much on tourism as our main source of income, our main GDP, our main income earner. And that is very intricately linked to climate change issues as well and sustainability issues. In many respects, we are policy takers, we're not policy makers, which means that in terms of the vulnerability of our supply chains, during COVID, many of us were completely locked out of supply chains for pharmaceuticals, for the vaccines that we needed. And now with what's happening in terms of geopolitics and the trade tensions, again, sometimes we almost feel like we are in the passenger seat rather than in the driver's seat, just waiting to see what the policies and decisions of the larger countries will be. So there are some inherent vulnerabilities there. We're all very small. We're all very vulnerable. We have a limited population, limited land, some of us do. But the thing is all about perspective, because now we're realizing, listen, we're small island developing states, but we're large ocean states. We have incredible ocean space, which is so unexplored and underexploited. And these are things that we are also thinking about when we look at the blue and green economy, the ocean economy, which we're investing in so much. But I have to say, despite these vulnerabilities, many of us have really been stepping up, and saying, listen, we have a voice. Here are our realities, and we want these realities taken into account in terms of international decision making, international rules and regulations. So, for example, Barbados, very small country, but with a big idea, the Bridgetown Initiative. And this was led by my prime minister, but owned by many countries around the world right now. Just to give you one concrete positive outcome of a small developing country's advocacy, we have managed to get the World Bank and the IDB to incorporate disaster-related clauses in their loans, which means that when you do have a climate-related disaster, you can pause on the repayment of your loan to give you an opportunity to catch up. Now, that sounds like the most obvious thing in the world, but it didn't exist. And that can provide comfort to developing countries. It can provide comfort to creditors as well. And frankly, if the aim of development aid, development loans, development grants is to build sustainable countries and communities, you have got to look at certain elements like this disaster risk clause. And that's just one of many things that we've been able to do as a small island developing state. But we need larger countries to listen to us. We need larger countries to take our priorities on board when they're at the negotiating table, and to give us space at that negotiating table as well to make sure that our views and our priorities are reflected.
Amazing. So with some of the work that you're doing with the WTO working group on MSMEs, what are some of those most positive developments that you're seeing coming out of initiatives like that?
I'm so happy that the WTO is discussing issues of small business, that the WTO is discussing issues of trade and gender, that they're discussing issues of plastics pollution and sustainability issues and fossil fuel subsidies. And I think sometimes the outside world, they do not realize the richness of the discussions of the WTO. They often look at the fact that we've not been able to have any multilateral agreements for a few years. We've not been able to move some plurilateral agreements forward as a sign that the WTO is failing and that we're not keeping up with the reality. But if you're really on the inside, you can see that we're discussing a lot of really relevant contemporary issues. And frankly, I think small businesses are one of those issues. We have got to make trade rules and trade regulations with small businesses at the forefront of our thought. Many of us have a small business ecosystem, which is about 90% of our income generation, 80 to 90% of our jobs as well. It's going to solve our youth unemployment problem here in Africa and in the Caribbean as well. So we have got to make sure that their concerns are on the table. So this WTO MSME group is not a negotiating group. We're not looking at making rules and making regulations. This is to share what we're doing, to give a space for small businesses themselves to highlight what their priorities are, and to just make sure that we keep small businesses and MSMEs at the forefront of our mind when we're negotiating. And in that group, we've been able to discuss everything from informality to good regulatory practice, to the role of business support organizations, to access to finance for women-owned enterprises, to authorized economic operators. And these are just some of the topics that we've been discussing over the past 2 years. Looking at trade facilitation issues, for example, looking at standards, looking at intellectual property and how incredibly important it is for women-owned enterprises in particular. And of course, also looking at issues of finance, because if you look at all of these surveys that have been done for the past decade, there are two things that stand out to me. Number one and number two on the list is either access to finance or access to knowledge and market information. And we have got to be able to address these issues. Now, number three is always lack of confidence, which means we also have to do more to build the confidence of small entrepreneurs. But we have got to be able to solve this finance gap and this knowledge gap. So one of the things that I'm really proud of from the MSME working group is the Trade for MSMEs website, which is really a collator of a lot of information and analysis that other agencies are doing on SME issues, where it's a one-stop shop where small businesses and policymakers can go and find out really incredible and contemporary information of use to their business community. In addition, we also have something called the Trade for MSMEs game, which is a bit of a choose your adventure game that policymakers and entrepreneurs can use to, in a way, plot and plan their export growth and whether or not you have to pay tariffs here and what the import tariffs would be and whether or not you need to meet certain standards. So it's a really fun way to chart your export journey. And we work very closely with the ITC on the Global Trade Help Desk, which is really the most wonderful tool for anyone trying to figure out how to get their goods and services from A to B.
Hey, enjoying this podcast? Hit that follow button for more. Done? Let's get back to it.
Amazing. So you mentioned the trade finance gap. Obviously, that's one of those issues in trade that's talked about a lot. What are some other issues that you think are critically important to the trade space, but don't receive very much attention?
I think maybe we could be talking about sustainability requirements a little bit more, because frankly, these are going to be some of the opportunities and barriers of the next generation of business, where you're going to have to find this very delicate balance between protecting people, plant health, and the environment, but also making sure that small businesses are able to stay afloat and be able to get their goods into other markets. So issues around CBAM, for example, or other carbon border adjustment measures, it worries me because I'm not sure how much the views and priorities of small businesses are being taken on board, especially small businesses in developing countries who will still want to be able to access those markets. So I think we need to continue that discussion. I also feel that we need to start to look at how trade interacts with other issues like labor, for example. And I know that there's been quite some interest in looking at this relationship between trade and human rights. Now, I don't think the WTO is ready for that, but it's something that I still think that we should be thinking about behind the scenes, to be honest with you, because we have to make sure that trade, which increases the bottom line, does not negatively impact on the social reality of communities as well.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the fisheries industry. So going back to obviously a lot of those smaller island states, having the ocean nearby, very important part of a lot of those economies. Why do you think that the fisheries industry, why do you think it's difficult to get a lot of meaningful engagement on that front with some of those bigger organizations?
I think we're actually doing okay on fisheries. Granted, we have been negotiating fisheries subsidies agreements for almost 2 decades now. And you know that we have one, which they call Fish One, which at this time that we're speaking, there are only 5 more countries that need to come on board for this fisheries agreement to be adopted. And I fully anticipate that that's going to happen in the next couple of weeks. And that's going to be a huge thing because this is the first time that there's been a direct environmental sustainability element to a WTO multilateral agreement. And this is all about addressing issues of illegal and IUU fishing, which is something that plagues many small developing countries. We do not have the ability to police our own waters. And it means that some larger fleets often come into our waters using techniques which are very dangerous to our reefs, for example, and to our ecosystem, and take away our fish, let's be frank. So this fisheries agreement makes it very clear that these things are simply not acceptable. Now, we are in the middle of negotiating what I would call a second part of that agreement, which is really focused on subsidies and the fact that you have a large number of big fishing nations who give an incredible amount of subsidies, which, as you know, skews the competition. It allows them to take more fish from farther away, often in the waters of some of our developing countries who don't have that capacity to either capture that fish or to be able to give the level of subsidies that they give. And this is a very, very important agreement. And many developing countries in the ACP, from the Caribbean and the Pacific and from Africa, have been at the forefront of this agreement, saying that we need to address these issues. And we came very, very close at the ministerial conference last year in Abu Dhabi, but 1 or 2 countries were not yet ready. And we've had quite a few, I would say, close encounters over the last few months where we thought we were almost ready to take it across the finishing line. But again, 1 or 2 countries were simply not ready. And this is no longer acceptable, because if we say that we care about the ecosystem, that we care about the fish, we care about the sustainability, we care about food security, then we need to do something about it. This has been in limbo for far too long. So, I'm also calling for some countries, including some big countries, to step up and show leadership and to make the right decision to make sure that we have an agreement on the table at the WTO that really does protect our oceans and protect our livelihoods as well.
Amazing. And when you're designing these policies, how do you strike that balance between making sure that you're protecting the environment, those ecosystems, whatever it may be, but also not making it too restrictive for some of those smaller fishermen or smaller businesses that might rely on access to those ecosystems for their own livelihood?
That's a great point. It's about balance. Trade agreements are not and should not be black or white. It has to be about finding balance, which means sometimes you don't have maybe an ideal agreement. You may have an agreement which does give a certain degree of flexibility, which is positive, because not all of us are at the same level of development. Not all of us have the same level of capacity. And the notion of special and differential treatment is built into the WTO DNA, which means that developing countries have all rights to have differentiated treatment to larger countries. So I think that's okay once it is something which is monitored. This is where the notification system and the transparency system is so incredibly important to see how things go. Because in fisheries, flexibilities should not lead to more negative effects on the ecology. It is about giving some countries and communities time to be able to build up the sustainability credentials to be able to fish in a way that it still supports their livelihoods, still supports food security, but doesn't endanger the fish stocks. But sometimes that takes time, sometimes it takes money, sometimes it takes technology transfer, sometimes it takes expertise. So it's all about facing the right direction and moving towards a situation where all of us will hopefully be on the same level, be able to take the exact same commitments, but sometimes it takes time. So it's all about balance.
And again, with this and other very important issues, having the right people in place at those organizations or at these levels to have these discussions is obviously very important and will continue to be very important down the road. So what would your advice be to younger professionals that are looking to get into the trade space or some of these policy spaces, and especially for those that might be coming from some of these underrepresented regions in the world?
And my advice is to be very, very bold. And even if you are not a middle power in terms of size or population, act like you're a middle power. Act like you have something to say. Act and believe that you deserve a seat at the table as well, and engage. Also hone your emotional intelligence skills. Those are so incredibly undervalued. So you must, of course, know your trade law. You must, of course, understand your politics. You must, of course, be very good at research and analysis and make sure your arguments are evidence-based. But this is also about interacting with people and helping them to understand your perspective and your point of view. So emotional intelligence, the ability to make sure that your voice is heard and that your message is understood, is very important. So work on those skills. I think that the world of trade and development is very, very wide. Now, I know that there has been, shall we say, some dislocation of late because of some decisions that have been made in terms of international development assistance. But trade is part of services, trade is part of tourism, trade is part of labor, trade is part of IP, trade is part of IT, trade is part of human rights. Also find areas where you feel that you would really be able to commit. And last piece of advice, which is maybe a little bit silly, but honestly, it is some of the best advice I have ever been given. Find a job that you love, but also find a job that you're good at, because sometimes the two things are not the same thing. And when you find that lovely sweet spot where you feel that you're valued and you're valuable, you're good at it and you like it, then boy, the world is your oyster.
Amazing. So we're here at the ITC SME Ministerial in Johannesburg. What's been one of your biggest takeaways from the event and some of the conversations that you've been having around the conference?
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful opportunity to put SME ministers in front of the small businesses and the trade promotion organizations in a very intentional way. Labor ministers come together every year. Health ministers come together every year. Trade ministers come together every 2 years. Environment ministers come together every year. SME ministers don't really do that. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity, and I thank ITC for taking this initiative. But now the next step is about making sure it's not just about talk. It's how do we measure and monitor the call for action that will be issued this afternoon? And how do we ensure that small businesses don't come back to SME Ministerial in 2 years with the exact same problems that they have? We have got to find clear ways to solve their issues around market access, around access to finance, around access to knowledge, about building their skill set, about helping them to really use digital in a way which is intelligent and helping to narrow the digital gap as well. So I hope that in the 2 years between this event and the next one that they hope to have, that some real intentional work is done to address a lot of the really important issues that they've heard here directly from small businesses.
Amazing. So Matthew, we've heard some of the challenges that small island developing states face, some of the work that you're doing at the WTO, some of these messages for SMEs and policymakers around to help improve these challenges. Thank you so much for being here on Trade Treasury Payments.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. And remember, recommit to multilateralism, because this is really the only way that we're going to solve global problems with global solutions. So thank you so much.
And don't forget to follow Trade Treasury Payments
On your favorite podcast platform.
Thanks for listening.